Okay, so I've been talking about doing this particular presentation for quite some time now, and this will be on the uh, deportation of the Volga Germans and other ethnic German communities in European areas of the USSR into northern Kazakhstan and Siberia during the Second World War, and their subsequent persecution at the hands of the Soviet government, and all the way up until really 1955, the end of that year, 13th of December, the last remaining contingent of Russian Germans, the adult men and women who were not members of the Communist Party or other leading institutions of society, are finally released from the special settlement. Restrictions and a greater normalcy, while by no means complete, since they're not allowed to return to their former areas of residence, develops among ethnic Germans in the Soviet Union. So, the Volga Germans were the largest German community in the Soviet Union, in the Volga German ASSR, and then the neighboring Saratov and Stalingrad Oblast. About 450,000 of them lived at the time of the deportation in August 1941. It was not the first group of Germans that were forcibly resettled. And that would be the Germans in Crimea, about 50,000 who were forcibly relocated from the Crimean Peninsula into the northern Caucasus, particularly what was then Ordzhonikidze Krai, now Stavropol, as well as Rostov Oblast, and then deported with the ethnic Germans already living in those regions after the October harvest into Kazakhstan. But because they're the largest group, 450,000 out of the initial 800,000 ethnic Germans forcibly deported from European areas of the USSR into Siberia and northern Kazakhstan as special settlers, the Volga Germans are a symbol, I guess, kind of a metonym. Certainly, their date of deportation serves as the day of commemoration for the entire Russian German population of the Soviet Union. So, the commemoration takes place on 28th of August. Now, on 28th of August 1941, the Soviet government, through the Presidium of the Supreme Soviet, issued a decree falsely accusing the Volga Germans of harboring thousands and tens of thousands of diversionists, awaiting orders from Nazi Germany to start blowing things up. And of course, this accusation is completely false. They found almost no spies or saboteurs in the Volga German ASSR during the time between the Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union, 22nd of June 1941, and the 28th of August 1941. Now, this accusation obviously has to become, because it's the published decree that to give legitimacy, to give a justification for the Soviet Union's ethnic cleansing of the Volga Germans. But it is not, of course, the first document. It's only the one that was published at the time. There is already on 25th of August a letter by Beria talking about the plans to deport all of the Volga Germans eastward as special settlers. in a letter he had written. On the 26th of August, the actual deportation order with instructions is issued in secret by the SNK, the Council of People's Commissariats, and the Central Committee of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. And this is really the deportation order itself, rather than the 28th of August one, since while legally the Presidium of the Soviet Union had to give a stamp of legitimacy in order to at least have some legal semblance under Soviet law, although the deportation was in clear violation of the 1936 Soviet Constitution and the 1937 Russian Soviet RSFSR Constitution, not to mention the 1937 Volga-German ASSR Constitution. But nobody paid attention to such things as legality at this time. But they did want to provide some legitimacy that the deportation had some sort of reason. So they came up with this lie, this libel, that the Volga Germans were all traitors to the Soviet fatherland. This, of course, was not true. And the Soviet government itself admitted that it was a lie and not true on a decree issued on 29th of August, 1964. Now, today is August 27th. I'm doing it the day early. But August 27th is the day that the NKVD under Beria came up with the NKVD instructions that were issued for carrying out the deportation. The deportation was to take place, and did take place, between 3rd of September and 20th of September. Some 450,000 Volga Germans from the Volga German ASSR, 375,000 or so, and then the remainder from the neighboring Saratov and Stalingrad Oblast. Most of them, about 75%, deported into Siberia, particularly Western Siberia, although there are about 75,000 deported into Krasnoyarsk Krai in Eastern Siberia, and then Northern Kazakhstan. And this is followed up by deportations of ethnic Germans from the Northern Caucasus, from Azerbaijan, from Georgia, from Ukraine, particularly Eastern Ukraine, since Western Ukraine had already come under the rule of the Wehrmacht, and therefore the German population there was temporarily safe from being uprooted and deported to Kazakhstan or Siberia. From the cities of Moscow, areas surrounding it, Tula, these areas were all ethnically cleansed of the German population. About another 350,000 ethnic Germans, bringing the total up to about 800,000 people. And they are placed under special settlement restrictions in various kolkhozes, mostly in northern Kazakhstan and Siberia. About 400,000 deported to both places, so half and half. But again, 75% of the Volga Germans going to Siberia, and then the opposite for areas outside the Volga, 75% going to northern Kazakhstan, and only 25% to Siberia. Now they are housed mainly in already existing kolkhozes, in already existing houses with already existing residents, Russians mostly in Siberia, and ethnic Kazakhs mostly in Kazakhstan. This causes a lot of tension. In particular, in many cases, if not the majority of cases, they do not have a common language with the Kazakhs, but even so, this is not considered. They're not considered treated particularly well by the local population, who sees them as people taking up sparse resources in terms of housing space, as well as available food, although they are at the bottom of the ladder, just above prisoners in terms of allocation for any type of resources. And it is the lack of proper housing, food, winter clothing, and medical care for the deported Germans that leads to extremely high mortality and morbidity rates among them. All told, between 1941 and 1948, deaths outnumber births among the deported Germans, and about a fifth of the population, close to 250,000 people, prematurely die as a result of the physical conditions of material deprivation, but also forced labor deliberately imposed by the Stalin regime upon them on the basis of their ethno-racial categorization. So the massive deportation, since it's done region by region, takes a while. It's not completed until December of 1941, so it takes place throughout the fall, September, October, and November, with them all finally arriving in areas of exile internally within the USSR before Christmas Day, the Western calendar. Most of the ethnic Germans were Lutheran, with a large Catholic minority, as well as a Mennonite and some Reformed tradition. Almost none of them were members of the Orthodox Church, so they would have almost all celebrated Christmas on 25th of December rather than the 7th of January. So there's a horrible material condition. They're completely impoverished, and this leads to them being a problem when combined with the hostile attitude they meet from the local inhabitants, as well as the fact that, having been deprived of all their property to the point where now they don't have sufficient food or clothing or housing, they are not very happy. And it is viewed as a socially explosive situation. So there are a couple of more mass mobilizations to remove ethnic Germans from the initial area of the deportation and send them to other areas, even more remote in many cases, to work as a labor force. But one of the things that happens in the Soviet Union is the rapid advancement of the German army captures most of Ukraine, as well as big chunks of southern Russia, Belarus, all the way up to the gates of Moscow. And this means that the Soviet Union loses a lot of agricultural land, including that used to raise livestock in Ukraine and parts of Russia and Belarus. So protein deficiency is a problem for feeding the Red Army. And the main way they get around this is through Lend-Lease, the importation of spam through the U.S. through Iran. But one of the things they try to do is increase production of protein sources in eastern areas of the Soviet Union. So one way they do this is to try and increase cattle in Kazakhstan, and the German special settlers are involved in that somewhat. But really what the big push is to develop the fishing industry in the Arctic region, in the far north of Siberia, along the rivers such as the Yenisei and the Ob, and some 40,000 ethnic Germans are mobilized and sent to work in the fishing industry in the Arctic Circle in the Soviet Union to provide fish for the Red Army in January 1942. And this is the first big labor mobilization outside of the Kolkhoz system for the deported Germans. They are within the Kolkhoz system, but outside of growing of grain and raising of livestock, the moving of them to the catching and processing of fish. And of course, the conditions is so freezing cold, and you have to be in the rivers where it is extremely cold, and hypothermia is a problem. We do have a fairly significant increase in mortality rates. A large number of people suffer from hypothermia and then gangrene, amputation, and loss of limbs. Again, none of these people had been in the fishing industry before, so it was difficult for them. A number had been farmers, but it's interesting to note that the urban population in places like Engels, the capital city of the Volga German ASSR, were also settled on Kolkhozes predominantly, and that they too lacked the skills to work in their new conditions, even though it was menial labor. Difficult for a bookkeeper or a doctor or a teacher at a school to become a physical worker engaged in menial type of hard physical labor that existed on farms in the Soviet Union in the 1940s. We're talking a very low level of mechanization compared to, for instance, what exists in the United States today. There's lots of work that has to literally be done by hand. And not that there hadn't been great strides in mechanization during the 1920s and 1930s, but it was still considerably lower than today. And also, at this time then, we have the forced mobilization of ethnic Germans into the labor army, basically forced labor detachments working in Gulag camps under very similar conditions to Gulag prisoners, except that they have not been charged with any crime other than being ethnically German, or German by nationalnost, that is a racialized ethnicity, an ethno-racial category, one that is defined by blood, ancestry, and lineage. And there had been no trials and no convictions, and they are sentenced for the duration of the war, so there's not even a concrete sentence in terms of time to be served. But as far as material conditions, such as rations, such as barracks, such as discipline, almost identical to convicted Gulag prisoners. And the first decree in 10th of January 1942 applies to adult able-bodied men. And they want to conscript 120,000, but they fall considerably short. They're only get about 90,000. Work on railroads, work on building industrial factories in the Urals, or manufacture aluminum and smelting of iron. Also cellulose processing. And the most of them also then going to the biggest bulk to camps devoted to the felling and processing of lumber, timber, chopping down and cutting down trees, which is very arduous physical labor. And this led to a very large number of these people dying from accidents, from overwork, from malnutrition, from various diseases due to the very poor sanitary conditions in the barracks. So the next thing that happens then is that there's still a shortage of labor, and it's increasing as large numbers of them either die or have to be released because they are so weak they can no longer work, and then most of those people die after being released, although they are recorded as released rather than dead in the Soviet records. But it was much easier for the Soviet Union to release people that were close to death and let them die outside of the camps than to let them die in the camps and actually record it. So there's about equal numbers overall between those who actually die in the camps among the German Labor Army conscripts and those that are released because they are too weak and emaciated to continue to work and then perish shortly thereafter outside of the camps. So there's not enough, though on 14th of February 1942, there's another mobilization, and this is aimed at the ethnic Germans that were already living in Kazakhstan and Siberia prior to the deportation. So this group of people is smaller, but they're in better condition, so able-bodied workers, a greater percentage of them can be conscripted. So out of this population, some over 40,000 are mobilized and sent to labor army work sites and camps, again mostly in the Urals, mostly dedicated to felling trees and processing of those wood after it had been chopped down. And finally, in the summer, massive mortality and morbidity again greatly lowers the number of workers in these camps. And there is another mass conscription in 7th of October 1942. And this one, in addition to over 75,000 men, includes over 50,000 Russian-German women. And most of the men are sent to work in the coal industry, and most of the women in the oil industry. So they can, and unlike the previous decrees, most of these men sent to work in the coal industry work directly for the People's Commissariat of Coal, but are under the supervision of the People's Commissariat of Internal Affairs. But they're not working directly in NKVD corrective labor camps that are part of the Gulag, like the first two waves of conscripts. And the women are mostly working under the administration of the People's Commissariat of Oil, but again supervised by the People's Commissariat of Internal Affairs, although some 20,000 women or so actually do their labor army service in corrective labor camps, ITL, as do the majority of the Russian-German men conscripted into the labor army. Now this service in the labor army lasts for most of the conscripts up until about 47, 48, when the piecemeal dismantlement that begins in 1945 is completed. And of the 316,000 or so Russian Germans forcibly conscripted into the labor army, about 60,000 to 100,000, depending on which estimates you look at, perish either in the camps themselves. The recorded numbers of dying within the camp is over 25,000, or shortly after release. So if we're just relying upon a conservative estimate of what the Soviet government's own figures count as far as deaths within the camps, and then people released that mostly would have died because they were released for being invalids. We're talking about 60,000. But if we factor in huge difficulties, and I talk about this in my article in the Russian Review, and gaps in the recorded numbers, the real number could be much higher, perhaps 100,000 or so, or a third of the labor army conscripts that were ethnically German perishing within the period of time 1941 to 1948 as a result of the poor conditions they suffered, both in terms of malnutrition and exposure, untreated diseases, exacerbated and spread by unhygienic living conditions, as well as accidents. If a tree falls on you, you're probably unlikely to survive, particularly if there's no medical attention available, and other causes. So, including people who are arrested and tried in the labor army for various crimes and then shot by the Soviet NKVD. Right? So, bullets are another hazard, although a relatively small minority of the deaths. So that goes through until they are released to go to the special settlements, where they make an effort and are in some cases, but not always, successful in reunifying with their families, attempt to start again. Others never reunify with their families. Some of them, particularly men from the labor army, take new wives, especially Russian wives, and start new families, a whole new life after the horrible experience that they suffered as forced laborers. So this is probably, in terms of intense persecution, the worst part of it. The separation of families, the high mortality rates, high rates of injury and disease in the labor army, where some 316,000 out of 1.3 million ethnic Germans in the Soviet Union. But looking at, again, we have to remember, they're only including people that are able-bodied adults. So it is, in fact, a majority of this contingent by a significant amount. That those people that remain, about 1 million or so other ethnic Germans, are either children, for the most part, the sick, the elderly, or in some cases, but not in the majority, people who are allowed to stay to look after. But often, Russian German children were placed with people who were not able-bodied, or people who weren't even Germans, put in to be looked after by Russian kolkhoz families, or sent to state orphanages. About 9,000 or so that are recorded ended up in state orphanages. Others weren't allowed in state orphanages. They accompanied their older relatives, usually parents, mother in particular, but in some case sibling, particularly sister, into the labor army work sites where they had particularly high rates of disease in the barracks, especially measles. So overall, a rather horrific, horrible experience. Of course, unlike Buchenwald or Dachau or Mauthausen, any of the concentration camps or labor camps that the Nazis run, I'm not speaking of the extermination camps, of which in what becomes West and East Germany after the Second World War, there were no extermination camps. There were only the Soviet type concentration camps and labor camps. But in many cases, many of the Soviet versions were much worse for most of their existence because they had fewer resources allocated to prisoners. All right. Now, in the special settlements, of course, they're restricted. They can't move more than 3 kilometers. They have to check in for any movement with the local NKVD authority. They can only go for 3 days. They need this internal passport and visa to check in with the NKVD upon leaving, then upon arrival and leaving again under strict control of their movement in place of residency, which greatly limited their ability to find employment, confined them to jobs the NKVD wanted them to have, which meant for the most part either agriculture or, as we can see with the mobilization of people into the labor army, extractive industries in particular. We see a large number being moved into the coal mining industry, and that remains the case after their release from the special settlements. It also limits their ability to get higher education, and of course, they are also banned from universities in areas of exile. Particularly notable, Kazakhstan prohibits them during this time from attending universities. Explicitly racial discrimination in the sphere of providing higher education. And this goes through to the end of the Soviet Union. They have the lowest rate of attending universities of almost any nationality in the USSR in the post-Stalin era, having been one of the most educated ethnic groups in the Tsarist and early Soviet period. So this discrimination continues. They are way below Russians, Kazakhs, Koreans, Jews, other ethnic groups in Kazakhstan in terms of admissions. They are simply just banned on the basis of their German ancestry, their German heritage. All right, so we have then finally births exceed deaths among the special settlers for the first time since the deportation in 1941 in 1948. Although legal restrictions are tightened, they are made eternal, and the punishment for attempted escape increased to 20 years of hard labor in 26th of November 1948 by decree of the Presidium of the Supreme Soviet. But Stalin dies on 5th of March 1953, and this begins a process of reform. Special settlers are released gradually. In the case of the Germans, we start to see certain categories: Communist Party members, teachers, veterans of the Red Army, those that had been in the eastern areas of the Soviet Union before 1941, being released between 1st of January 1954 all the way up to the final group is released in 13th of December 1955. And the largest group released early on, the first big group, are children under the age of 16, and along with this group, children over 16 to 18, seeking higher education, need to leave the confines of the area of special settlement that they had been deported to or assigned. Not all of the special settlers were deported. Those that are born in special settlements receive special settlement status upon birth. Those that were already living in Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan before the deportations are made special settlers and have their movement and other civil rights restricted by the Soviet government between 1945 and 1946. After the end of the Second World War, when there is no threat whatsoever from Nazi Germany or any other entity that might be culturally or historically connected to the Germans. The Nazis had been thoroughly defeated. Berlin made into a pile of rubble along with most other German cities by 9th of May 1945. So those people were also condemned. And then finally, about 200,000 ethnic Germans who had been evacuated by the Nazis or the Wehrmacht or who had fled west into Germany, forcibly repatriated, forcibly sent back to the Soviet Union with the collaboration of American and British soldiers. And these people were sent to very harsh conditions in special settlements in the Soviet far north, in Kazakhstan, in Siberia, in Tajikistan, where they worked on cotton colhoses. So this was the final group sent to the special settlement restriction. All right, so I've gone on for over a half hour now. It's been 35 minutes. They are all released, as I say, by 13th of December 1955. They are not allowed to return to their former areas of residence. They are not allowed to pursue any remedies to try and get compensation for property confiscated during the deportation in 1941. A huge amount of particularly collective property in terms of agricultural goods and equipment, but also stuff that is irreplaceable, libraries, archives, particularly those in Angles, churches, graveyards, these type of very important monuments to people's culture and heritage was not only separated from the people forcibly by moving them eastward, but then either through neglect or sometimes deliberate vandalism, the churches and the graveyards and other buildings, including the libraries, deliberately destroyed or damaged. So a huge amount of cultural capital permanently lost as a result of this crime against humanity. So in exile, which I've given in the series, they gradually attempt to reconstruct their lives, but again, the loss of German language schools, the loss of compact areas of settlement, the loss of their churches, greatly damaged their ability to maintain German language and other elements of their culture, and they became highly Russified in a manner during this time. All right, so we get to the second half of what I wanted to talk about here with regards to the deportation and the massive persecution during the Second World War, both in terms of its legal elements, restrictions on civil rights, but also in terms of its material elements, deprivation of basic necessities needed to live, and the resulting damage to the German ethnic group in the Soviet Union in terms of its demographics, large numbers of deaths, very much lowered fertility and birth rates, as well as incredible damage to many of the survivors in terms of their health, both physically, but probably more importantly, mentally. And this, of course, is something that is continued to the present day among the population of Russian Germans in the former Soviet states and those that have emigrated back to Germany since 1987. All right, so this is not a detail, a aspect, a event of World War II that is much discussed at all anywhere in the world, but particularly not among the Anglosphere, especially the United States, even though in the United States there are some 1 million people of Russian German descent, many of them having blood relatives that survived this trauma and later emigrated to Germany, or in some cases even still living in Siberia or Kazakhstan. And yet, we look at the numbers involved: 800,000 people forcibly relocated, ethnically cleansed, and then 300,000 people sent to labor camps, another 200,000 forcibly repatriated, somewhere around 250,000 premature deaths as a result of this deliberate government policy. One would think that it might register somewhat as one of the important things that happens as far as aspects of cruelty and oppression and crimes against humanity, especially since all of this is motivated by what has become the single most important theme in the conceptualization of history and theory in modern decades, as class has been removed as an element of analysis, and that is race. That is, the Germans were clearly, in terms of their categorization by the Soviet government, as people based on ancestry and lineage, that is, blood, an ethno-racial group. And we compare this to the huge amount of information disseminated in a propagandistic way, often on, say, the much less oppressive, much less deadly, and much smaller ethnic group, the Japanese diaspora, that was removed from the coastal regions of California, Oregon, and Washington, as well as the border, California and Arizona with Mexico, inland, and put in, for the most part, internment camps because they didn't have housing of relatives or other places to go. And so 120,000 people of Japanese descent, of which 70,000 were U.S. citizens, were forcibly removed, and for the most part spent the years 1942 to 1944 in internment camps. This is a much smaller number, and their conditions were much better, both in terms of their physical treatment, but as well as their legal status, particularly long term, than the ethnic Germans deported into Kazakhstan and Siberia, special settlers, and then mobilized into the labor army. And yet, there is a huge amount of uh, material talking about the evils of the U.S. government in interning the Issei and Nisei, and almost nothing on the Soviet repression, persecution of ethnic Germans from 1941 to 1955. All right, so one could say, well, because the U.S. government was the one that was involved, because some 70,000 of the 120,000 Japanese interned were actually U.S.-born citizens, that this makes sense, that Americans should concentrate on what happens in the U.S. rather than what happens to people who are foreigners. Well, that's fine and dandy, except that we'll say even much greater than the focus on what happened to Japanese Americans during the Second World War is the focus on what happens to Jews in Europe at the hands of the Nazis during the Second World War and the Holocaust between 1941 and 1945. And now the numbers killed are greater than the case of the ethnic Germans, but it's not by orders of magnitude. Right? Most of the scholarly estimates are in the range between 5.1 and 5.8 million Jews dying during the Second World War of various causes, of which direct murders by the Nazi regime are probably around 4 to 4.5 million. All right. So there isn't any 6 million figure in actual reality. There is one in propaganda. But if you go through and look at all of the actual scholarship, the numbers generally, I say, almost all of them fall in between 5.1 and 5.8 million. And not even all of those are deliberate killings in the sense of there being a Nazi responsibility. Included in those numbers are Jewish soldiers who fought in the Soviet Red Army and died on the front. Included in those numbers are Jewish partisans that were killed fighting in guerrilla operations in Poland and elsewhere against the Nazis. Included in those numbers are people who just died of old age during the war, as well as people who died from the fact that the war brought about greater hardship than normality, but they were no harsher than other groups surrounding them. Right? This is why, as I said, the direct murders, maybe 1 million shot by the Einsatzgruppen, and some 3 million killed in death camps. You get about 4 million. And if you include people worked to death and dying of malnutrition in ghettos and other places, you get maybe 4.5 to a little bit more deaths. Right? But that still means you still have hundreds of thousands of people who died of other causes that were not deliberate victims in the sense of being shot or gassed or even worked to death in camps. As I said, the numbers include people who starved to death in Leningrad. Right? Obviously, it's a deliberate killing, but no more deliberate than what was imposed upon the Russian majority in the city by the Nazis. It includes people that died fighting at the front. Again, we generally don't consider soldiers to be victims. And it includes Jewish evacuees who died in the Soviet Union because of lower rations and harsher conditions. But again, the type of wartime victims that we wouldn't consider to be direct victims of genocide under normal cases. So, but even so, even if we take a number of 5 million, it's considerably higher than 250,000 of ethnic Germans. But I don't think it's 20. There's 1/20th of the attention given to the plight of ethnic Germans in the Soviet Union as there is to the Jewish Holocaust. All right, so it's maybe 1/1000th, right? I would say somewhere around there. So it's much lower. And a big part of this is the fault of people of ethnic German descent themselves. Russian, German, American communities did very little up until the 1990s to publicize, to memorialize, to even study and collect information on these events within their own community. Really, it's only people of my generation that started really to look at and research and write about and speak about these events. They were not something that people of my father's generation who were born during or immediately after the Second World War dealt with, and certainly not something people who had lived in the United States through the Second World War among the ethnic group wanted to speak about or talk about or make public among the ethnic group itself, yet alone the outside world. All right, so I would say that we look for reasons why so much emphasis is placed on the Holocaust in comparison. That, or even the Japanese internment, a lot of it has to do with the ethnic groups themselves making concerted efforts to first commemorate it within their own communities and then make it a public information to people beyond them. But this is it had perverse problems, particularly for the Russian Germans, and that it has led many scholars in the United States to believe the Soviet false allegations of mass treason issued in 1941, even though the Soviet government, as early as 1964, completely repudiated these charges. Mikoyan said basically that Stalin was a liar, that the Russian Germans had been loyal Soviet citizens and had worked hard and had contributed to the victory over what the Soviets called fascism, but obviously the Italian contribution is rather small. So what we're really talking about is National Socialism by the Germans. And so I think, though, if we want to know why this situation has occurred, a lot is because until the 1990s, there wasn't a emphasis or really even interest. In some sense, there was kind of an aversion, maybe even a fear, in some sense, of not looking strong and not looking American enough, of not looking accountable enough on their own to look at the collective fate of ethnic Germans in the Soviet Union. And one of the things that triggers the change is, of course, the ethnic Germans in the Soviet Union finally being emancipated in the 1980s under Glasnost and Gorbachev, to be able to speak and write about their own experiences, and of course by then the experiences of their parents and grandparents during the Second World War. So in some sense, the leadership obviously was coming from what remained of, in terms of any type of viable ethnic community among the Russian Germans in Russia itself and Kazakhstan and other parts of Central Asia. All right, so I'm going to wrap this up in an hour and 7 more minutes. But even given the need for accountability among the Russian German diaspora in the United States and Canada, in particular, I won't speak about Argentina because I don't know that much about it, in neglecting to have a fully fleshed out narrative of the history in the 20th century to come to grips with the persecution and oppression at the hands of the Stalin regime and what it did to the group and what it means as part of the larger narrative of the Second World War and the larger narrative of the history of Russian Germans and the larger history of the Soviet Union. I still think there is obstacles institutionally. So people no longer as powerful as they were, like Deborah Lipstadt, claiming that anybody who claims that there were German victims of the Allies, and her main focus, she doesn't even mention the Russian Germans directly, is the Germans ethnically cleansed from Eastern Germany and Czechoslovakia, the Sudetenland, at the end of the Second War. That anybody who expressed concern about the plight of these civilians, mostly women and children, was a Holocaust denier. Right? Well, but she herself, of course, denies a number of genocides. She claims that the Armenian genocide was not an attempt of a total extermination of a people back in 1993. She then changed her tune because the Turkish government fell out with the Israeli government, and her foremost loyalties were to the state of Israel. But what she says about citizens of the Soviet Union, that no citizen of the Soviet Union assumed that death or deportation were inevitable consequences of his or her ethnic identity. And that is just bullshit. Not only the Germans, but earlier the Koreans, the Poles, and then later Kalmuks, the Karachais, the Chechens, the Ingush, the Crimean Tatars, all of these people targeted for mass deportation to areas with known fatal living conditions on the basis of their ethno-racial category. All right? The fact that they weren't killed in gas chambers is, as Ernst Nolte said, really irrelevant. And I think we need to rehabilitate people like Ernst Nolte, people looking at the Second World War in its totality as a colossal tragedy for many groups, including people of German heritage and ancestry, particularly those in the Soviet Union, people who, for the most part, with the exception of a few in Transnistria, never had anything to do with the Nazi regime or any other German government for that matter. To look at this and not have a completely Judeo-centric view of the Second World War. The number of deaths in the Second World War was much, much greater than the 5 million Jews in Europe, and much, much greater consequences in terms of the world than just what happened to that particular ethnic group. And in the United States, the narrow focus, as if that was the only case of genocide in world history, if they're the only people who ever suffered during the Second World War on the basis of their ancestry and lineage, is basically a lie. It's more than a myth, it's a lie. And so I'm going to leave it here, coming up in the next 3 minutes. Commemoration, everybody, tomorrow, the 28th of August, to have a moment of silence for the victims of the deportation, special settlement, and labor army among the ethnic Germans in the Soviet Union, who were sent to Kazakhstan and Siberia, to rethink how we think about the Second World War and genocide, and to have a larger, more universalistic conception of it, to look at details from the point of view of objective history rather than merely what the victors wrote. The idea that if you win the war, that everything you do is morally justified is another bullshit idea that needs to go away forever. And unfortunately one that Americans are particularly prone to embrace, particularly those on the left side of the political spectrum. And this is why we see this idea that nothing the Soviet Union did is condemnable because they were fighting against the Nazis, and the Nazis were the greatest evil ever, and therefore we can't condemn or criticize their many cases of ethnic cleansing, genocide, forced labor, and other atrocities. Right? This is the moral view of pygmies, and I think we should be larger, more magnanimous, more liberal in the old traditional sense of the 19th century in our historical views of what happened. Right? It's time to look at the Second World War objectively rather than merely from the point of view of the victorious Allies, and to realize that while after Nazi Germany invaded the Soviet Union, that it was temporarily an ally, that the older view in the 1930s, but also the view during the Cold War, which is now largely rejected by people younger than me who all claim to be socialists, that the idea of the Soviet Union an evil empire was actually correct. They did lots of evil things, including race-based genocide. One of the larger groups during the Second World War subjected to this race-based genocide were the over 1 million ethnic Germans, who were almost all loyal Soviet citizens, but were treated as traitors and horribly punished. All right, so I'll leave it at that, just over an hour. Hope everybody enjoyed that, or at least learned something. Maybe not enjoyable is the word. Hope everybody learned something.